Every great civilization in history has either collapsed or is still running its experiment. That second category is smaller than it sounds. The civilizations that appear to be ongoing, the United States, the European Union, China, are not the same civilizations that existed a few centuries ago. They are new configurations built partially on the ruins and legacies of predecessor civilizations that did collapse, sometimes violently, sometimes gradually, always in ways that the people living through the collapse failed to fully anticipate until it was happening around them. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, Mycenae, the Hittites, Ugarit, the kingdoms of the Levant, collapsed within decades of each other around 1200 BCE in one of history's most dramatic and least fully explained civilizational failures. The Western Roman Empire collapsed between roughly 376 and 476 CE. The Tang dynasty collapsed in 907 CE after nearly 3 centuries of cultural and economic flourishing. The Khmer Empire, which built Angkor Wat, collapsed in the 15th century. The Maya classic civilization collapsed between the 8th and 10th centuries. The Mongol Empire, once the largest contiguous land empire in history, fragmented within a century of reaching its maximum extent. The pattern is real. The question is whether it is actually a pattern, whether there is a common mechanism or set of mechanisms that drives civilizational collapse across cultures, time periods, and geographies, or whether each collapse is unique and the apparent pattern is an illusion produced by survivorship bias and retrospective narrative. The answer, when you go through the evidence carefully, is both. Each collapse has unique features. There are also structural similarities that appear so consistently across different civilizations in different conditions that they almost certainly reflect something fundamental about the dynamics of complex societies. Let's go through it properly. Start with the definition problem, because civilizational collapse is not a straightforward concept, and the way you define it determines what you're explaining. When historians and archaeologists talk about civilizational collapse, they mean something specific: a rapid reduction in social complexity, typically within a period of decades, or at most a century or two, involving the loss of centralized political authority, the disintegration of long-distance trade networks, the abandonment of large urban centers, the reduction or disappearance of literacy and monumental construction, and often a significant reduction in population. This is different from civilizational transformation, the gradual change of one political form into another, and different from civilizational defeat, the military conquest and absorption of one society by another. By this definition, collapses are real and well documented. The Maya classic collapse involved the abandonment of cities that had sustained populations of tens of thousands for centuries. The Bronze Age collapse involved the destruction of the Ugaritic palace economy, a sophisticated international trading system, within a generation. The Western Roman collapse involved the depopulation of major cities that would not reach their Roman-era populations again for 1,000 years. These are not historical narrative conventions. They are demographic and material facts visible in the archaeological record. Now let's talk about the structural factors that appear consistently across different collapsed civilizations, because this is where the interesting comparative analysis lives. The first and most consistently documented factor is complexity overshoot. Every expanding civilization adds complexity as it grows. More bureaucracy to administer larger territories, more infrastructure to connect distant regions, more military capacity to defend extended borders, more specialized labor to sustain the economic functions that the larger society requires. Each layer of complexity requires maintenance, taxes, labor, administration, supply chains, and maintenance costs grow faster than the productivity gains that the complexity enables. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter, who developed the most rigorous formal theory of civilizational collapse, argues that this dynamic is the fundamental driver of most collapses. Societies invest in complexity because complexity solves problems. It allows coordination of large populations, management of environmental resources, defense against external threats. But the returns on complexity investment diminish over time. Each additional layer of administration, each additional fortification, each additional bureaucratic function provides less benefit per unit of cost than the previous layer did. Eventually, the maintenance cost of the existing complexity exceeds the marginal benefit of adding more, and the society is in a structural bind. It cannot grow its way out of its complexity costs because further growth requires more complexity, which costs more than it produces. At this point, any significant stress, a drought, a plague, a military defeat, a trade disruption that reduces the resources available to maintain the existing complexity triggers a cascade. The society cannot afford to maintain all of its complexity. Some function fails. The failure of one function impairs other functions that depended on it. The cascade accelerates. What looked like a stable, powerful civilization reveals itself to be a house of cards where the bottom row was always the most load-bearing and the most fragile. The Bronze Age collapse illustrates this pattern precisely. The Eastern Mediterranean civilizations of 1200 BCE were extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily interconnected. The Ugaritic palace economy was importing tin from as far away as Afghanistan, and copper from Cyprus to produce bronze, the essential material of the military technology that sustained every palace state in the region. When this supply chain disrupted, for reasons that are still debated, involving some combination of climate change, drought, internal rebellions, and the migrations of the peoples historians call the Sea Peoples, the interconnection that had made the civilization powerful became the mechanism of its collapse. Every palace state depended on every other. When enough of them failed, all of them failed. The second consistently documented factor is environmental stress, and specifically the intersection of environmental stress with social complexity in ways that amplify the impact of both. Civilizations are not separate from the ecosystems they inhabit. They are embedded in them, dependent on them for the food, water, timber, and material resources that sustain their populations and their complexity. Civilizations also modify their ecosystem through agriculture, through deforestation, through irrigation, through urban expansion, in ways that frequently reduce the long-term carrying capacity of the environment, even as they temporarily increase the productivity that allows population growth. The Maya classic collapse provides one of the most extensively studied examples of this dynamic. The Maya lowlands were heavily deforested by the classic period. The construction of the massive limestone monuments that characterize Maya cities required enormous quantities of timber for fuel to process limestone into cement, and the agricultural expansion required to feed growing populations had cleared forest at rates that the poor tropical soils of the Yucatan could not sustain. The deforestation changed the local climate, reducing rainfall and increasing temperature through the elimination of forest evapotranspiration. Drought became more frequent. Agricultural yields fell. The palace states that had sustained complex Maya civilization found themselves unable to feed their populations. Paleoclimatic data from lake sediment cores in the Maya region shows a significant drought period coinciding precisely with the timing of Maya classic collapse. But the drought was not an external factor acting on an otherwise stable civilization. The civilization's own land use practices had made the landscape more drought vulnerable. The collapse was the intersection of an environmental stress that the civilization's own activity had amplified with a social complexity that had grown to depend on productivity levels that the modified landscape could no longer sustain. This pattern, civilizational land use practices reducing the resilience of the environment that the civilization depends on, followed by collapse when environmental stress exceeds the reduced resilience threshold, appears in enough cases that it is almost certainly a structural feature of the civilizational dynamic rather than a coincidence. The third factor is elite, over-extraction, and the political economy of collapse. Complex civilizations require surplus extraction, the collection of resources from productive populations to fund the administrative, military, and infrastructural functions that maintain the civilization's complexity. This extraction is the economic foundation of civilization, and it creates a specific political dynamic that tends toward instability over time. Elites, those who control the extraction apparatus, have consistent incentives to increase their share of the surplus. More resources for elites means more luxury consumption, more political influence, more ability to fund patronage networks that sustain their position. The mechanisms of elite competition for status, for resources, for political power drive a progressive increase in elite resource consumption over time in most well-documented civilizations. The problem is that elite over-extraction reduces the resources available to maintain the productive capacity that generates the surplus in the first place. Peasant farmers who are taxed beyond their ability to maintain their farms reduce agricultural productivity. Artisans who cannot invest in their tools and workshops produce less. Infrastructure that cannot be maintained because the surplus has been consumed by elites deteriorates. The extraction system that generates the elite resources undermines its own productive base. Peter Turchin's cliodynamics research, the quantitative historical analysis of political violence and civilizational instability, has documented this dynamic with striking consistency across a wide range of historical civilizations. Periods of elite overexpansion, growing numbers of elites competing for a resource base that is not growing proportionally, consistently precede periods of political instability, civil conflict, and in some cases, civilizational collapse. The mechanism is the compression of the productive population and the destabilization of the political system through elite competition for shrinking resources. The fourth factor is the fragility of information and institutional knowledge. Complex civilizations encode their complexity in institutions, legal systems, administrative procedures, technical knowledge of agriculture and engineering and medicine, cultural practices that transmit the social norms that allow large-scale cooperation. This encoded knowledge is what distinguishes a complex civilization from a collection of individuals. It allows the society to function at a level of complexity that exceeds what any individual could manage alone. But institutional knowledge is fragile. It exists in the minds of specialists, in the documents and records that specialists produce, in the training systems that reproduce specialists across generations. When a civilization is under stress, when population falls, when administrative systems fail, when the surplus that supports specialists disappears, the institutional knowledge that encodes the civilization's complexity can be lost within a generation. And once lost, it cannot be reconstructed from first principles quickly enough to prevent the cascade administrative failures that the loss triggers. The Western Roman collapse illustrates this with painful clarity. Roman engineering knowledge for road construction, for aqueduct building, for concrete production, for the organization of large-scale construction projects did not survive the collapse at a level sufficient to maintain the infrastructure that Roman civilization had built. The aqueducts fell into disrepair, the roads were not maintained, the cities that had depended on the infrastructure shrank or were abandoned. The knowledge to rebuild was not available, not because the physical materials were absent, but because the institutional knowledge of how to organize the labor, manage the supply chains, and maintain the technical standards that Roman infrastructure required had been lost along with the administrative systems that had sustained it. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now let's talk about something that almost never appears in popular accounts of civilizational collapse, but that the historical record makes surprisingly consistent: the role of disease and demographic collapse in triggering and accelerating the cascade of failures that characterizes civilizational collapse. Disease is not simply a background stress that weakens civilizations at the margins. In several documented cases, epidemic disease was the primary trigger that converted a civilization already at its structural limits into one that was actively collapsing. The Antonine Plague that struck the Roman Empire beginning in 165 CE and the later Plague of Cyprian beginning in 249 CE killed substantial fractions of the Roman population at precisely the period when the empire's structural vulnerabilities, overextended borders, increasing barbarian pressure, currency debasement, elite instability were accumulating. The demographic shock of epidemic mortality reduced the tax base, the military recruitment pool, and the agricultural labor force simultaneously, accelerating every structural deterioration that was already underway. The Black Death's impact on European civilization in the 14th century provides a different case study, one in which epidemic mortality was so severe that it actually disrupted the feudal social order in ways that paradoxically contributed to the eventual emergence of more productive and more equitable social arrangements. The labor scarcity produced by plague mortality gave surviving peasants bargaining power that the feudal system had systematically denied them. The resulting social disruption was traumatic in the immediate term, but contributed to the conditions that eventually produced the Renaissance and early modernity. The relationship between epidemic disease and civilizational collapse is therefore not simple. Epidemic disease operating on a civilization at its structural limits accelerates collapse. Epidemic disease operating on a civilization with sufficient adaptive capacity can produce painful but ultimately productive restructuring. The difference lies in the resilience reserves that the civilization has available when the shock arrives. Now let's talk about something that connects the structural analysis to lived experience in a way that most accounts of civilizational collapse miss. What collapse actually looked like to the people living through it, and why it was so consistently unexpected even when the warning signs were visible. The inhabitants of collapsing civilizations rarely experienced their civilization's collapse as a single dramatic event. They experienced it as a series of deterioration. Roads that were repaired less frequently, grain prices that rose faster than incomes, bandits that became bolder in the countryside, administrative decisions that took longer to implement and produced less effective results. Each deterioration was explicable in local terms. This particular harvest was bad. This particular road was damaged by an unusual flood. This particular official was corrupt or incompetent. The systemic character of the deterioration, the way that each local failure connected to and amplified every other local failure, was invisible from inside the experience. This perceptual limitation is not a failure of intelligence or attention in the affected population. It is a structural feature of how complex systems fail. Complex systems are specifically designed to absorb local failures without producing system-level visible signals. That absorption capacity is what makes them robust in normal times. When a complex system is approaching its structural limits, the same absorption capacity that has been an asset becomes a liability, masking the accumulation of stress until the system crosses a threshold and the cascade becomes visible all at once. By the time the systemic failure is obvious to everyone, it is typically too late to prevent it through the normal mechanisms of political and administrative response. Now let's talk about the interaction of these factors, because the most important thing to understand about civilizational collapse is that these factors rarely operate independently. They interact with each other in ways that amplify the impact of each. A civilization that is already at its complexity ceiling, where marginal returns on additional complexity have fallen close to zero, is more vulnerable to environmental stress because it has less adaptive capacity. Adding complexity to solve the problem of a drought or a plague is exactly what the society cannot afford. A civilization that is simultaneously facing elite over-extraction and environmental stress is doubly constrained. The resources that would need to be redirected toward environmental adaptation are being consumed by elite competition, and the institutional knowledge that would allow adaptive responses is being maintained by specialists who are increasingly chronically underfunded. The historian and systems theorist Jared Diamond summarized the core dynamic as a failure to anticipate and respond to impending problems due to a combination of factors that include the inability to perceive slow-moving threats, the conflict of interest between elites who benefit from the status quo and the need to change it, and the collapse of institutional mechanisms for collective action at exactly the moment when collective action is most needed. This is the most chilling aspect of the civilizational collapse pattern. The factors that make collapse likely: complexity, overshoot, environmental degradation, elite over-extraction, institutional fragility, are not sudden shocks that arrive without warning. They develop slowly, over decades or centuries, in ways that are often visible to at least some observers within the civilization. The collapses happen not because the problems were invisible, but because the political and social dynamics of the civilization made effective response to visible problems impossible. There is a specific psychological and institutional mechanism that makes this failure of response so consistent across different civilizations and time periods. The people who benefit most from the status quo, elites who have prospered under the existing system, specialists whose position depends on the existing institutional structure, populations whose daily welfare depends on the continuation of the existing economic arrangements, are precisely the people with the most influence over the response to civilizational stress. And they are precisely the people with the most to lose from the kinds of structural adaptation that might prevent collapse. Reducing complexity costs money and power from those who benefit from complexity. Reversing environmental degradation requires redirecting resources from current consumption to future resilience, which is politically costly in the short term. Redistributing surplus from elites to productive populations reduces elite resources and elite political power. Every structural adaptation that would reduce the probability of collapse is simultaneously an adaptation that would reduce the position of the most politically powerful members of the civilization. The political economy of collapse is a political economy of gridlock, in which those with the most power to change course have the most incentive to maintain it. This brings us to the question that the title implies, but that most accounts of civilizational collapse avoid asking directly. What does the pattern mean for contemporary civilization? The contemporary global civilization is the most complex in human history. It is also the most interconnected. The Bronze Age palace economy was a remarkably integrated trading system for its time, but it connected perhaps a dozen major states across a region. The contemporary global economy connects nearly 200 states across every continent with supply chains that span the planet and that are sufficiently integrated that disruption in one node propagates rapidly throughout the system. The 2020 disruption of global supply chains by the COVID pandemic provided a real-time demonstration of how fragile extended interconnection can be under stress. The environmental modification that contemporary civilization has produced is orders of magnitude larger than anything that preceded it. The climate modification from fossil fuel combustion, the biodiversity loss from habitat destruction, the freshwater depletion from agricultural extraction. These are civilizational scale modifications of the planetary environment with implications for carrying capacity and resilience that are still being assessed and that the civilization is only beginning to incorporate into its planning. The elite over-extraction dynamic that Turchin's research documents in historical civilizations is measurable in contemporary economic data. Income inequality in most developed countries has been increasing for approximately 5 decades, with the share of surplus captured by the highest income individuals growing consistently relative to the productive majority. And the institutional knowledge fragility that contributed to the Western Roman collapse has a contemporary analog in the fragility of the technical and administrative systems that modern civilization depends on. Systems that are maintained by specialists whose knowledge is not widely distributed, encoded in infrastructure that requires continuous maintenance, and vulnerable to failures that can cascade through interconnected systems faster than any historical precedent. None of this means that contemporary civilization is necessarily headed for collapse. The historical pattern of civilizational collapse does not constitute a deterministic law. It constitutes a warning about structural vulnerabilities that have reliably preceded collapse in past civilizations and that are present to varying degrees in contemporary civilization. The difference between historical civilizations that collapsed and the ones that managed decline rather than catastrophic failure typically came down to adaptive capacity, the ability to reduce complexity in a controlled way before uncontrolled reduction became inevitable, to modify environmental practices before degradation exceeded recovery thresholds, to redistribute surplus in ways that maintained the productive capacity of the population, and to maintain and transmit institutional knowledge through periods of stress. These are not mysteries. They are challenges that the historical record has characterized in detail in multiple civilizations across multiple time periods. Every great civilization that has collapsed left behind the record of how it happened. The question that the pattern raises is not whether collapse is inevitable. It is whether the civilizations that came after learned anything from the ones that came before. The historical record on that question is, to put it diplomatically, mixed.